He didn't even want to fly first class, his daughter insisted. Frank Mallory, 73, kept things simple. Always had. He wore his usual jeans, weathered boots, and an old army jacket with the patches removed long ago. His daughter, Laura, had upgraded his ticket for this flight. She wanted him to travel comfortably for once, not squeezed into economy with his bad knee and stiff back. She even joked, "First class, Dad, like the hero you are." Frank didn't feel like a hero. He hadn't for years. As he boarded the plane, he moved carefully, gripping his cane with one hand and the boarding pass with the other. Seat 2A, first class. A window seat, just like Laura picked so he could rest easy. He nodded politely to the flight attendants, who smiled but quickly shifted their gaze to the passengers behind him. Sliding into the wide leather seat, he exhaled slowly. The cabin smelled of leather and aftershave. The other passengers, polished businessmen tapping at laptops, a young woman scrolling through her phone, barely acknowledged him. But soon, he felt the glances. Quick, cutting, assessing. Does he belong here? He kept his eyes on the tarmac outside, watching the luggage carts move like ants. The first comment came quietly. A man in a navy suit leaned toward a flight attendant. "There's a man sitting in 2A. He might be lost." The attendant approached, polite but firm. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" Frank handed it over without a word. She checked it, nodded, but the uncertainty lingered in her eyes. She moved away, but not far. The whispers didn't stop. Wrong seat. Probably wandered up from coach. Doesn't look like he can afford it. He'd heard it all before. Supermarkets, restaurants, even VA clinics. People saw the limp, the old clothes, the scars. Judged the surface, never the story, never the service. A new voice cut through the cabin, sharper. "We've got a situation in first class," someone said into a radio. Within minutes, 2 airport security officers boarded the plane. Passengers' eyes followed them eagerly, phones angled up, recording. The lead officer, a younger man, built like he spent more time in a gym than a war zone, stepped toward Frank. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with us." Frank kept his voice level. "Why?" "You're causing concern among the passengers." "Concern?" He held up his boarding pass again. The officer barely glanced at it. "Please don't make this difficult." The other passengers leaned in, waiting for a scene, hoping for it. Frank gripped his cane tighter. The pain in his knee pulsed, but it wasn't from the injury. It was from the weight of this moment. "Not again." The officer's hand closed around Frank's shoulder. "Sir, now." As Frank stood, slowly, painfully, nobody noticed the cockpit door sliding open. Nobody noticed the pilot stepping out. Nobody noticed the way the pilot froze, staring at Frank like he'd just seen a ghost. Frank kept his head low, gripping the cane with his left hand while the officer's grip tightened on his right shoulder. The younger officer's touch wasn't cruel, but it was firm. Firm like someone used to removing problems, not people. Passengers whispered louder now. Phones angled up, recording the moment. Some pretended not to look but leaned just enough to catch the scene. They want a show. The businessman across the aisle smirked and shook his head. His suit was spotless. Cufflinks gleamed under the cabin lights. The woman beside him clutched her designer purse closer to her chest. "Shoulda known," the man muttered, trying to get a free ride. The flight attendant from earlier stood by the galley, watching but saying nothing. Her eyes avoided Frank's. The lead officer gestured. "Sir, this way." Frank moved slowly, not out of defiance, but because his body demanded it. His right knee, shattered during his second tour, ached with every step. The cane helped, but not much. "I've walked through worse than this. Sandstorms, mortar fire, cities in ruin. Now I'm walking through judgment." As they passed row 4, a young boy peeked over the seat back. His mother quickly pulled him back, murmuring something about strangers and troublemakers. Frank's boarding pass fluttered to the floor as the officer urged him forward. He didn't bother to pick it up. "Doesn't matter. Nobody's reading it anyway." The cabin door loomed ahead. Beyond it, The jet bridge stretched cold and empty. The officer radioed in. "We're removing the passenger now. Situation under control." The second officer followed close behind. His gaze wasn't hostile, but it wasn't kind either. Just another man doing his job. "Like I used to. Orders. Always orders." As they reached the threshold, Frank felt the weight of every eye behind him. Not one spoke. Not one questioned the decision. Not one asked if he belonged in that seat. But someone was watching. At the cabin door, the pilot stood frozen, his cap slightly tilted, his eyes wide, jaw tense. That face. Why is he looking at me like that? The pilot turned to his co-pilot and whispered words Frank couldn't quite hear. But the tone was unmistakable. Shock. Recognition. "That's him," the pilot said. "That's Sergeant Mallory." The cold metal of the jet bridge creaked beneath Frank's boots as they stepped out of the cabin. His knee screamed in protest, but he forced it to steady. Behind him, the murmur of voices faded as the flight attendants closed the door. "They think it's over, that I'm gone, problem solved." The lead officer spoke into his radio again. "Passenger has been removed. Situation resolved." Frank didn't argue. What was the point? He'd shown them the boarding pass. They didn't care. The truth wasn't welcome in first class today. "I've stood before generals, senators, even presidents. But a few businessmen and a flight attendant think I'm a threat." He leaned against the wall of the jet bridge, taking pressure off his bad leg. His cane felt heavier than it should have. "Sit tight, sir," the younger officer said. "We'll figure this out once the crew verifies everything." Verifies? As if he hadn't already proved himself. A group of maintenance workers rolled a cart past, barely glancing at the scene. Just another delay, another day. But behind the sealed cabin door, something was changing. The pilot hadn't returned to the cockpit. He stood at the door, gripping the frame so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Sergeant Mallory. I know that name. I know that man." He remembered a desert sky lit with fire, a young lieutenant trapped beneath rubble, a man with a steady voice saying, "You're not dying today, sir." That man had carried him through gunfire, through smoke, through chaos. "He saved my life." The co-pilot noticed the pilot's distant stare. "Captain, we need to prep for takeoff." But the captain didn't move. Instead, he took off his cap. "No, not until I speak to him." The businessman in seat 2B noticed the pilot's hesitation. "Is there a problem, Captain?" The pilot ignored him. "If Sergeant Mallory isn't flying, neither am I." He handed his cap to the co-pilot and stepped out of the cockpit, walking toward the sealed door. The flight attendants exchanged nervous glances as the captain reached for the intercom and said, "Delay takeoff. I need to speak to a passenger who's just been removed." The officer stood beside Frank, arms crossed, waiting. No apology, no explanation, just waiting for clearance to escort him back into the terminal, like a problem to be filed away. Frank kept his eyes down, focusing on his breathing, slow, controlled, like they taught him. Inside the cabin, the passengers settled back into comfort. The businessman flipped open his laptop. The woman with the purse whispered, "Finally." They thought it was over, that the disturbance had been handled. But the captain hadn't moved from the doorway. He motioned to the nearest flight attendant. His voice was quiet but firm. "No one flies until I speak to Sergeant Mallory." The attendant hesitated, then nodded. The cabin crew paused the final preparations. Whispers spread, confusion, unease. The captain stepped out, walking briskly down the jet bridge. His cap remained in the cockpit, forgotten. His stride was purposeful, the same stride he'd used on deployment long ago. Frank looked up, surprised to see the man approaching. The captain stopped in front of him. His voice softened. "Sergeant Frank Mallory?" Frank nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." The captain swallowed hard. His eyes glistened. "You probably don't remember me. Lieutenant James Parker, Fallujah. You carried me out when I was trapped. His voice cracked. "You saved my life." Frank blinked. Memories rushing back. Smoke. Screams. Blood. A young officer pinned beneath rubble. Frank's arms burned as he lifted him clear. "It was a long time ago," Frank said quietly. "Not to me." The captain took a breath. "And not to this flight." Passengers leaned into the aisle, eyes wide, phones lowered. Silence spread across the cabin. The captain turned to the officers. "This man has more right to sit in first class than any of us." The lead officer opened his mouth, but the captain raised a hand. "Return him to his seat. Now." Frank steadied his cane, unsure if his legs could carry him back. But the captain reached out. "Allow me." He gently took Frank's arm, guiding him back toward the cabin door. Passengers shifted in their seats, embarrassed, ashamed. The businessman stared down at his keyboard. The woman with the purse looked away. The flight attendant who'd questioned Frank earlier wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. The captain spoke loudly enough for all to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, if Sergeant Mallory doesn't fly, neither does this plane." The cabin fell completely silent. Frank paused at the cabin door, the weight of the moment pressing heavier than any gear he'd ever carried. He looked at the captain, then at the passengers who had watched him be removed without a word of protest. The businessman who had smirked now stared at the floor. The woman who clutched her purse crossed her arms tightly, face flushed with shame. The captain guided Frank gently back to seat 2A. "This seat was yours from the beginning. It still is." Frank lowered himself slowly, pain shooting through his knee, but he held his head high. The cane rested against the armrest, a silent reminder of all he'd endured. The pilot turned to the flight crew. "Please assist Sergeant Mallory and notify the gate we are resuming boarding." A new murmur rippled through the cabin. This time, it wasn't judgment, it was respect, uneasy, belated respect. The businessman cleared his throat, as if to speak, but words failed him. He sank deeper into his seat. Frank glanced toward the front of the plane. His boarding pass still lay where it had fallen, ignored. The young flight attendant bent to pick it up and returned it to him without a word, her hands trembling. As the remaining passengers boarded, the captain leaned down beside Frank. His voice was lower now, private. "I spent years trying to find the man who saved me. I never imagined we'd meet like this." Frank's reply was simple. "I was just doing my job." The captain nodded slowly. "So am I." Outside, the ground crew resumed loading luggage. Inside, the cabin had shifted. No longer a courtroom of silent judges. Now, it was a room full of witnesses to a different kind of service. The captain returned to the cockpit. The door closed softly behind him. The plane began to push back from the gate. Frank rested his head against the window, eyes heavy, but his thoughts sharper than ever. They thought they were removing a mistake, but they almost removed a memory, a promise kept. The engines hummed beneath the cabin, a low, steady sound that masked the tension still hanging in the air. Frank sat quietly in 2A, his cane resting against the armrest, the returned boarding pass in his lap. He could feel the shift around him, the way passengers who had judged him now avoided his eyes. The businessman stared blankly at the back of the seat in front of him. The woman with the purse kept her head turned toward the window. No more whispers, no more phones raised, just silence. The flight attendant brought him a glass of water without being asked. Her hands shook slightly as she placed it down. I'm so sorry, sir." Frank nodded once. "Thank you." The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be departing shortly. I want to acknowledge an oversight earlier. We failed to recognize the service and sacrifice of one of our passengers." A pause, the kind that pulled every ear toward the speakers. "Sergeant Frank Mallory served our country with honor. He earned more than a seat in first class. He earned our respect." Murmurs rippled again, different this time. Words like hero, service, sacrifice. The businessman shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He opened his mouth but thought better of it. Frank kept his gaze forward. Respect forced is never as strong as respect earned. The captain continued, his voice firm. If anyone aboard takes issue with Sergeant Mallory's presence in first class, I invite you to speak now. Otherwise, let's proceed in gratitude." No one spoke. The co-pilot closed the cockpit door. The engines roared louder. The plane taxied toward the runway. The power had shifted. The man they tried to remove now had the silent acknowledgement of everyone on board. Not because he demanded it, because he'd lived it, because he'd earned it. As the plane rolled toward the runway, Frank could feel the eyes behind him, not with suspicion now, but something heavier: regret, guilt. The businessman who had muttered about freeloaders finally stood, his face pale, lips pressed in a thin line. He leaned into the aisle, voice low. "Sir, I..." Frank raised a hand gently. "Sit down. It's done." The man hesitated, then sank back into his seat, staring out the window. Across the aisle, the woman with the purse dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I'm sorry." Frank nodded without turning. He didn't need apologies. He needed understanding. A flight attendant approached. Her earlier sharpness was gone, replaced with something close to reverence. "The airline's manager is on the line. He asked me to pass on a personal apology, sir. And your daughter has been notified you'll be arriving on time." Frank's breath caught for a moment. Laura. She'd wanted this flight to be special. Instead, it had almost become a nightmare. "Thank you," he said quietly. The captain's voice came over the intercom again. "For those just joining us, we had a delay earlier due to a misunderstanding involving a passenger seat assignment. That has been resolved." His tone sharpened. "And let me be clear, entitlement is thinking someone doesn't belong because they don't look the part. Honor is knowing better." The passengers sat in still, heavy silence. Frank's grip tightened around the cane. Not in anger, in memory. "I didn't fight for medals. I didn't fight for recognition. I fought so people could live free, even free to judge men like me." The engines roared. The plane gathered speed. And for the first time that day, Frank felt the weight begin to lift. The nose of the plane lifted, pressing Frank gently into his seat as the ground fell away beneath them. Clouds gathered outside the window, soft, endless, untouched by judgment or pride. A flight attendant returned, setting down a tray. "Complimentary meal, sir." And the captain requested this. She placed a glass of bourbon beside the meal. Top shelf, not the cheap stuff. Frank raised an eyebrow. "I didn't order that." She smiled softly. "It's not an order, it's a thank you." He nodded, touching the glass but not yet drinking. The captain's voice came over the intercom once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, at cruising altitude, we'll be offering a toast to Sergeant Mallory and all who've served." A ripple of agreement moved through the cabin. Some clapped quietly, even those who had once doubted him. The lead security officer who had removed him earlier stood just inside the cabin door now, cap in hand. He waited until the aisle cleared, then approached. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Sir, I was out of line. I should have checked twice. I should have seen." Frank looked up calmly. "You followed orders. That's what we're taught." The officer nodded, swallowing hard. "Even when it's the wrong call." Frank reached out, clasping the young man's shoulder. "We all learn. That's how we grow." The officer's shoulders relaxed. "Thank you, Sergeant." As he stepped back, Frank finally lifted the glass of bourbon. Not for the drink, for what it meant. Passengers raised their glasses in quiet solidarity as the captain's voice echoed through the cabin. "To Sergeant Mallory, and to all who serve, not just in uniform, but with courage, humility, and grace." The clink of glasses was soft but powerful, a sound of unity that couldn't be ordered or enforced, only earned. Frank took a slow sip, the warmth spreading through him. Maybe Laura was right. Maybe I did deserve first class, just not for the reasons they thought. Frank leaned back as the clouds drifted past the window, soft and endless. For the first time since boarding, his muscles began to relax. His phone buzzed gently in his pocket. He pulled it out with a steady hand. A message from Laura. Dad, did you take off yet? Can't wait for you to meet your grandson. He already knows your name. Frank's throat tightened. He typed back slowly. On my way. Tell him I can't wait either. He slipped the phone away and let his gaze sweep the cabin. The same faces that had once judged him now looked away, not out of disdain, but out of quiet respect. Even the businessman gave a small, sheepish nod when their eyes met. The captain's voice broke the quiet again, softer now. Before we begin our descent, I want to share something personal. Sergeant Mallory saved my life when I was just a young lieutenant. Because of him, I came home. I built a family. And today, my own son is in basic training, hoping to serve like the man who once carried me through fire. The cabin stirred with emotion. A few passengers wiped their eyes. Others bowed their heads. Frank closed his eyes briefly. I thought my service had been forgotten, that the battles I fought were just fading stories. But they weren't. They lived on, in the lives I helped save, in the families that grew because I stood my ground. The captain continued. For those who serve and those who remember why, thank you. Frank opened his eyes and gave a quiet nod toward the cockpit. Some debts never have to be repaid. They're honored. The engine softened. The plane began its slow descent toward home, toward family, toward the next chapter. The landing was smooth, the wheels touching down with barely a bump. As the plane taxied to the gate, passengers remained seated, unusually quiet. No rush to stand, no shuffling for bags. Frank gathered his cane and the folded service dog vest from his bag. He draped it gently over his lap, the faded patches still visible. Symbols of the past he carried not as weight, but as proof. The captain's voice came one final time. We've arrived. Please remain seated while Sergeant Mallory disembarks first. It's the least we can do. A flight attendant approached. Sir, we've arranged for a cart to meet you at the gate. Frank shook his head. I'll walk. The passengers rose as he stood. This time, no one looked away. No one judged. Heads bowed slightly as he passed. Even the businessman and the woman who had clutched her purse stood back to allow him through. The young boy from row 4 peeked over his seat again, wide-eyed. His mother didn't pull him back this time. At the cabin door, the captain stood waiting, cap in hand. It was an honor, Sergeant. Frank nodded. You became the leader I hoped you would. The captain's eyes shone, but he held firm. Because of you. As Frank stepped onto the jet bridge, he spotted Laura waiting with his grandson in her arms, her smile radiant, tears in her eyes. Dad, she whispered, we saw the story already. Someone uploaded it. You're a hero all over again. Frank chuckled softly, the pain in his knee forgotten. He reached out, touching his grandson's tiny hand. They tried to drag me out like I didn't belong, but I've carried this country and its people farther than they'll ever know. The terminal doors opened wide, and for the first time in years, Frank Mallory walked out not as a forgotten soldier, but as a man who had finally come home.